and welcome to the Down the Spirituality and Science Rabbit Hole podcast. My name is Jeffrey Taylor. I will be your host. I will be being joined later by Don Weiss, who's a retired professor of philosophy at SUNY Binghamton. But for right now, it's just me. The title of today's podcast is The Role and Importance of Myth. In a culture obsessed with literal truth and pragmatism, such as our own, the impoverishment of myth is increasingly, if only instinctively, felt. Never in the history has a civilization been so desperately devoid of content and perspective. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where should we go? What's the point of it all? We feel lost because we are unable to take seriously the maps that could give us directions. The sole content of the outer, objective, material world are objects and their respective interactions in space and time. Everything else arises in the inner, subjective, mental realm through the act of an interpretation. After all, in and by themselves, the world of objects and their interactions have no expression of innate meanings or emotions. What you're looking at here, this picture of a Giordano Bruno woodcut from a 19th century science text, depicts the quandary of the 21st century spiritual seeker functioning in the current scientific materialism worldview. Modern-day seekers of the spiritual feel like they are living in a dual schizophrenic lifestyle. We live in a world where materialism and scientific objectivity rule, and the world of the spiritual is forever separated by a barrier that only a few mystics seem to be able to penetrate. Seeing beyond the veil to live in both worlds seems an impossibility. For most, the religious experience consists of going to church, hanging up our coats and our brains in narthex, receiving our weekly dose of religion, and then collecting our coats and our brains to spend another week in the real world. That time of the spiritual can be very uplifting, but when the work week closes in, a little voice in our head tells us it's just not the real world. How can we possibly identify with the worldview of people like Jesus, or Moses, or the Buddha, or even Krishna? A world where mysticism, mystery, and miracles are a way of life. Today, Bruno's barriers, depicted here, seems almost impenetrable and on the other side, unattainable. Our current modern worldview is one of scientific materialism. Scientific materialism rests on the belief that everything there is or ever will be springs from the interactions of matter and energy and from absolutely nothing else. But is this so? Make no mistake, the idea that everything that is or ever will be springs from the interactions of matter and energy and nothing else is a belief, not a proven fact. Not one of religion's core beliefs, miracles, life after death, heaven, God, or the possibility of a personal transcendent experience has been ruled out by science. Rather, it is the widespread acceptance of the scientific materialism's beliefs that has made many people think so. However, there is a way to restore the balance between the material and the spiritual worldviews. But is it possible to make Bruno's barrier that we just talked about disappear? To do so, we need to better understand the strengths and limitations of scientific materialism. Both science and spirituality have the same goal: to discover the truth about our reality, world, and especially ourself. The weakness of any worldview is in the assumptions that it must use to bootstrap the creation of its core ideas. The scientific method needs a metaphysical background in which it formulates its theories. These faith statements are a necessity and a necessary set of assumptions that form the basis for hypothesis development. The primary worldview derived from these assumptions is what is called scientific materialism. This science worldview is solely derived from 5 basic assumptions about reality, and they are all difficult, if not impossible, to test by experiment. As such, they are taken on faith as a given. Yes, even scientists have their own set of dogmatic faith statements. Combine these 5 assumptions and you get the metaphysical framework that is the basis for all hypothesis development in the scientific materialism worldview. So here on the screen are the assumptions that are accepted on faith in the scientific materialism worldview. Number 1, objectivism. This assumption states that only reality of significance, the objects we perceive as the physical universe, exist, quote unquote, out there, beyond human subjective minds. Number 2 is metaphysical realism. This assumption states that the objective universe out there can be known by the subjective human consciousness. The human mind is separate and not part of this material universe. Number 3, the closure principle. The assumption which denies the possibility that any other than material influences can affect any aspect of the natural world. Number 4 is universalism, an assumption that declares that all rules and laws are universal in that they are the same in every location in the universe and at all times throughout the universe's existence. The last, number 5, physical reductionism. This assumption reduces all of the universe to physical entities and interactions that can be taken apart and dissected to the smallest level of measurement. So here are 2 models of reality. On the left is the scientific materialism we've been talking about. You can see it's a pyramid that starts out with physical matter, from which we get chemistry. From chemistry, we get biological organisms. From biological organisms, we get brains. And brains result in consciousness at the top of the pyramid. On the right-hand side is philosophical idealism, which is more mind-centric. In other words, it starts out with consciousness as the base of everything. Consciousness gives us physical matter, chemistry, biological organisms, and then brains. Now going back to the left side, as philosopher Rupert Spira puts it, the materialist perspective is not grounded in experience. It requires an abstract line of reasoning that presupposes the existence of a reality outside consciousness, although no one has ever experienced this, nor could they ever experience it. The materialist point of view asserts the reality of that which is never experienced, which is matter and energy. Matter's existence before consciousness is an unknown. In other words, it's an abstraction. We know that we have consciousness experience. You are conscious as you listen to my words. So consciousness is unquestionably known. In other words, it's concrete. Materialism purports that matter's existence before consciousness creates consciousness. So materialism is saying, let's use an unknown, abstract thing to infer the known, concrete thing. Most areas of logical inquiry start with the knowns to explore unknowns. Materialism gets it backwards. It says the unknown causes the known, that the abstraction causes the concrete. Albert Einstein explicitly acknowledged this issue in a conversation in 1930 with Bengali mystic and Nobel Prize winner, and I'm probably going to mangle this name, Rabindranath Tagore. Einstein was a materialist, believing in a world independent of consciousness, but humbly admitted that his framework was not provable. Quote, "I cannot prove that my conception is right, but that is my religion." End quote. That's right. Einstein said it. The foundation of modern science, ironically, is a form of religion. So going back to the right side here, dealing with philosophical idealism, this alternative is a perspective suggesting consciousness is fundamental and everything else, physical matter, energy, all the things that make up the material universe, including our brains, comes from and is experienced within consciousness. Matter is not that which produces consciousness, but that which limits it and confines its intensity within certain limits. The paranormal, such as psychic abilities and the mind's survival of bodily death, become expected. They are only paranormal and anomalous if we assume that consciousness comes from the brain. So to summarize, if consciousness is fundamental, the key implications are that materialism, the foundational assumption of modern science and much of modern thought, is wrong. Consciousness is not produced by the brain. Rather, consciousness is non-local to the brain-body system. Means we all might have latent psychic abilities. When our body dies, our consciousness does not die. Consciousness exists beyond space and time and the material. We are fundamentally all interconnected as part of the same underlying consciousness. Several thousand years ago, Plato seems to have realized what philosophical idealism really was. On the right-hand side of this picture, we see the world as we think we experiencing it. The people are out on the beach, looking at the sun, looking at the ocean, and they're saying this is the real world. Well, scientists will tell you that we experience the real world through our five senses. Our five senses evolved over time in order that we could deal with our surroundings in order to survive and eventually reproduce. Our five senses do not show us the world as it really is. It is a biased view of the world through our sensory perceptions. Plato seems to have realized intuitively that the world of matter was an illusion long before modern philosophical idealism refined the idea. It can be seen in his allegory of the cave, presented in his work, The Republic, written between 520 BCE and 515 BCE. In Plato's Republic, Socrates describes a group of people who have lived chained to the wall of a cave all their lives, facing a blank wall. The people watch shadows projected on the wall from objects passing in front of a fire behind them, and they give names to these shadows. The illusion of the shadows on the wall are the people's reality, but they are not accurate representations of the real world. They are an illusion. Socrates explains how the philosopher is like a prisoner who is freed from the cave and comes to understand that the shadows on the wall are actually not reality at all. A spiritual individual aims to understand and perceive the higher levels of reality through the mind and not through the senses. Okay, so what are things really made of? You remember one of those 5 assumptions of scientific materialism was the assumption that everything can be reduced to its basic components, known as scientific reductionism. Well, to make my point here, let's have an imaginary conversation with a 5-year-old scientist who asks the question, what are people made of? Well, people are made of muscles, bones, and organs. Well, then what are organs made of? Organs are made of cells. What are cells made of? Cells are made of organelles. Well, what are organelles made of? Organelles are made of proteins. Well, what are proteins made of? Proteins are made of amino acids. What are amino acids made of? Amino acids are made of atoms. What are atoms made of? Atoms are made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Well, what are electrons made of? Electrons are made from the electron field. What's the electron field made of? And there it comes to an end. No one can tell you what the electron field is made of. And sadly, here the game of questions must come to an end about 9 levels down. There is a hard limit of our own scientific understanding. To the best of our present ability to perceive and to reason, the universe is made from fields and nothing else, and those fields are not made from any smaller components. Indeed, a field can span the entire known universe. Now, the point I just made can be hard for some people to understand because of what they've been taught in school. Here you see on the left what an electron is not. I'm sure everybody is familiar with a diagram of the planetary atom. Planetary being, it looks like the solar system with the nucleus in the center and a bunch of electrons circling the nucleus, kind of whizzing around it, just like planets move around the sun. Sadly, this model of the atom has been known to be factually incorrect since the early 1900s. Yet we still teach it to all of our children. We still use the image of this as an atom when everybody who knows what's actually going on knows that this is not what an atom looks like. An atom looks like what is on the right. In other words, you see the little tiny spot of the nucleus there in the center, and you see in yellow the electron field surrounding the nucleus. Well, where is the electron in that yellow area? Quantum physics tells us it's everywhere. All positions are superimposed. It's not until you actually look and try and find the electron that it magically materializes in a particular place. So the fact that reductionism ends here is really the functioning end of the story. Sometimes a picture really is, or a diagram is, better than a whole bunch of words. So I'm going to build a diagram for you here, and we're going to start out with a simple horizontal line. On the bottom of that line is the inner realm. This is the realm of the mind, our subjective reality that we experience through the mind. On top of that, on the upper part of that, is the outer realm, which is the rest of the universe, what scientific materialism would call the universe out there. So now let's add a couple more things to our diagram. Below the horizontal line in the mind, this is our self-reflective intellect. This is the world of language. This is where we use language, and in our minds, when we're thinking about things, we usually form it in language. We reason in language. Now, on the upper part, in the outer realm of the universe, we have what are ordinary images and their interactions. Part of that is what we call consensus reality. Consensus reality is things we can agree on. For example, we can all agree on what a giraffe is. We can all agree on what a lion is. We can all agree on what a house is. Now, consensus reality does have its limits, because if 3 different people see a car accident, they might not all three describe the same thing. But the outer realm, which our culture has come to call consensus reality, this outer realm is shared across individuals. But the meaning and emotion evoked by these perceptual experiences isn't necessarily shared. They arise in our private inner realm that's below the line there. They are subjective. As such, meaning and emotion aren't part of consensus reality. Meaning and emotion cannot be directly shared the way the images and the actions of consensus reality are shared. In summary, none of what we call consensus reality or the real world out there expresses meaning or emotion directly. The world is only meaningless if one sees the outer realm as fundamentally separate from the inner realm. As such, these outer images work as keys to unlock our affective and intellectual potentials. Without them, our capacity for feeling and thinking wouldn't actualize. And here is the key point. Our mind needs a code to translate consensus images into thoughts and feelings that have meaning. Without it, there would be no bridge to connect between our outer and inner realms. So now to our diagram, we add the big blue circle of our unconscious mind. I dislike the term unconscious mind because it sounds like something that doesn't exist. Our unconscious mind, simply a better word for it is the obfuscated mind. It is kind of a hidden mind, but it's important to understand that the unconscious mind functions through symbolic cognition, not linguistic cognition. In other words, our unconscious mind functions with symbols and meaning. And from this, we project transcendental images into the universe. And the concept of something that is transcendental is very important because it means that it's coming about from our understanding of symbolic cognition. A good example of this is anyone who's had a deeply spiritual experience, no matter what that is, and you ask them to describe it to you. You want to know what they experienced. And they can't describe it to you. They attempt to use words, but somehow the words don't convey the actual meaning of what they experienced. This is the conception behind the transcendental. Okay, so now finally I get to what a myth actually is. A myth is a translation code that takes its form in the way of a mental narrative we tell ourselves. A story that implies particular correspondences between the outer images of consensus reality and the inner feelings and symbols of ideas. The translation code is thus a myth. A myth is a story that implies a certain way of interpreting consensus reality so that we derive meaning and affective change from its images and interactions. As such, it can take many forms: fables, religions, folklore, and some you've probably never even thought about. Formal philosophical systems are myths. Mathematics is myth. And scientific theories are myth. Clearly, a myth can be true or false without ceasing to be a myth. Myth is the code that each one of us constantly uses, whether we're aware of it or not, to interpret life in the world. Myth is the very thing that allows the events of consensus reality to mean anything to us. For example, a hard-earned promotion at work only means a life well lived if one has adopted the myth that status, power, and wealth accumulation are the purpose of life. If none of these things were assumed to be important, what could such a promotion mean? Without a code for interpreting the consensus images all around us, life in the world would evoke no thought, no emotion, no conclusion. It would consist of pure and neutral observation without commentary. Another example. Take today's materialist neo-Darwinian cosmology. Its story suggests that the whole universe is a kind of machine and that its entire dynamics, including life, are driven by the combination of blind chance and submechanical laws. One might think that such a cosmology dispenses with myth altogether, but nothing is further from the truth. To say that nature is a mechanical apparatus without purpose or intentionality is itself an interpretation, a myth. The absence of myth would require a complete lack of interpretation or judgment of consensus reality. Turning the acorn into the oak. What does it mean to live a life of purpose and meaning? What did performance mean to Judy Garland? What did battle mean to George Patton? What did painting mean to Pablo Picasso? It is this transcendence that imbues life with the eternal significance of destiny fulfillment, as opposed to the evanescence of a mere chain of chance events. The whole impetus of life is to transcend, to get beyond the separateness, insignificance, and transience of the ordinary human condition. Garland, Patton, and Picasso transcend not because of their celebrity. Transcendence is far subtler than that. But because by following their dreams, they embodied, quote, a flowering of existence in the very creative and new way. Is the drive to transcend grounded in valid intuitions, or is it merely wish fulfillment? The predominant intellectual answer in our culture today is that transcendence is fundamentally impossible, for there is nothing to the human being but his biological body. This in itself is a myth, an interpretation of images. The problem is this. Although the personal and direct experience of a transcendent order leaves an indelible mark in the human mind, the experience itself is almost never abiding. Once it ends, one quickly falls victim again to the irresistible pull of ordinary life and its claustrophobic ethos. The issue is compounded by the impossibility to properly translate the experience into words and concepts, which makes recall very difficult. This way, the transcendent order quickly becomes a rather abstract and distant idea as opposed to a present and felt reality. At best, life becomes divided into the baseline dullness of ordinary existence and fleeting occasional excursion into transcendence. Either way, transcendence does not penetrate ordinary life. The impetus of human life is to transcend the limitations of the ordinary human condition and realize a form of eternal significance. Although transcendence can be experienced in mystical and spiritual states, the experience is almost never abiding and does not permeate one's ordinary life. In the picture here, both the circle and the rectangle are equally valid projections of the cylinder, conveying true information about it. The fact that the rectangle is completely different from the circle, an apparent contradiction in the flat world of shadows, implies no conflict in the world of the solid cylinder. A transcendent truth is to our intellect like a solid cylinder is to its shadows. The same transcendent truth can, in principle, appear to the intellect in different and apparently contradictory forms like circle and rectangle. The symbolisms of different but valid myths are the shadows of transcendent truths. The fact that a given myth apparently contradicts another does not necessarily imply that one of them is invalid. for exactly the same reason that the shadow circle does not imply that the shadow rectangle is invalid. Cynically dismissing all religious myths is tantamount to closing one's eye to the shadows projected by truth. By doing so, one willingly ignores the genuine insights that the shadows convey. However, if you intellectually take your religious myth to be the literal truth, as fundamentalists do, you will be closing your eyes to the cylinder. Moreover, if one grants validity only to the world of shadows, a logical implication is that shadows with different shapes cannot be concurrently true. Since the transcendent reality, the place where these differences are reconciled, is intellectually dismissed, the differences in shape must imply true contradictions. Here, fundamentalism is born. I know that my truth, my chosen shadow, is right, so yours can only be wrong. Cynicism and fundamentalism are two sides of one coin. Both practice voluntary blindness towards transcendent truth, one by refusing to acknowledge that shadows convey valid insights about it, and the other by taking a shadow to be the sole and complete truth. Important point: the validity of a myth is not decidable on the grounds of the intellect. Here is the mindlessness of fundamentalism. So petrified are we at the specter of a meaningless life that we now cling rather desperately to a particular, narrow interpretation of our chosen religious myth. Because of the complementary tendency towards cynicism and fundamentalism, we've marginalized our religious myths and made them small and flattened. Consequently, we've lost our connection with the transcendent. There can be such a thing as a deprived myth. A deprived myth is not the same as an absence of myth. A deprived myth is one that favors narrow and lame interpretations of consensus reality, interpretations that do not resonate with one's deepest intuitions. We live in a society dominated by increasingly deprived myths. One always lives according to a myth, for a continuous interpretation of consensus reality is inherent to the human condition. The question is whether one's chosen myth resonates with one's deepest intuitions or runs counter to them. Like the picture on the right, a deprived myth is reduced to a flattened, colorless image of real life. A special type of myth, a religious myth, can bring transcendence into everyday life, thereby saving people from existential despair. A religious myth infuses ordinary aspects of life with enchantment and significance. Accidents and coincidences become invested with hidden purpose. Our actions in the world acquire the importance of a cosmic mission. Our suffering becomes the center of critical insights. In a life informed by a religious myth, nothing is just so. Everything has a reason for being and a purpose to fulfill. Everything belongs in a bigger and timeless context. Religious myths are much disregarded and belittled today. Not that myth itself has disappeared. Moral and ethical codes, ideologies of every kind, and ontological interpretations of science, such as the metaphysics of materialism that we've talked about, are quite literally myths. So let's take the example of the Christian myth of the Trinity. God enters his creation by being born into it as the Christ. God as the Father explains and justifies the creation of the world. As the Holy Spirit, he maintains the world's significance on a continuing basis by infusing it with an invisible divine essence. This myth also provides perspective. God, this time as the Son, offers a concrete example of how to live life in accordance with his grand plan and achieve salvation. The divinity's entrance into its own creation informs both ethereal, the Holy Spirit, and the concrete, the Son, by providing a bridge between ordinary life and the transcendent order of the Father. This brings meaning into the world of many Christians, preventing ordinary life from becoming experienced as aimless and futile. We can't take seriously that which we don't consider true. It has become indispensable for us to rationally understand the how and why a religious myth can carry truth. Religious myths are powerless if they aren't seen as transcendentally true. But unlike traditional cultures, we subject our mythical intuitions to the scrutiny of reason. Therefore, if our lives are to be colored by religious myths again, it is imperative that we rationally understand how and why they can be true in a transcendent sense. Because traditional religious myths admittedly can't carry literal truth, our instinctive explanation for their sophistication and mutual consistency is to think of them as allegories for some kind of advanced cosmology. Something glaringly essential is lost when we reduce religious myths to just allegories. Allegories are quickly characterized by our intellects as marginally useful little stories that aren't really true after all. They just indirectly point to a truth that, we assume, can ultimately be described in some direct, explicit, accurate, and precise way, that is, in a literal way. Immediately, we start investing the whole of our intellectual and emotional energy in searching for this direct representation of the truth. The key to solving this riddle lies in realizing that truth is not restricted to only two categories, literal and allegorical, but there is a third and essential category, transcendent truths. The truth carried by religious myth is much more than merely allegorical, yet not literal.